Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really looking forward to talking about some of my research on minimalism. I started this project about 18, 20 months ago with a small research grant from the Royal Geographical Society. I'm still part way through. I'm kind of about halfway through. I've been interviewing minimalists across the UK and I've done about 15 so far. And I paused everything a little bit due to COVID and started analysing everything I had and realised that I already had quite a lot and I wanted to be able to share it. And so today I'm just going to take the opportunity to share with you some of the main findings of my research on minimalism so far. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to break it down into an introduction of what minimalism is, because of course I can't really talk to you about what my participants said about it without explaining the concept. Then I'm going to go over how I did my research, and then I'm going to present to you the main findings of that research. So I'm going to talk about all the people I spoke to, how they got into minimalism, their paths towards it, what their motivations were for becoming a minimalist or being a minimalist. One of their big key values, the dislike of consumerism, no real surprises there. And then I'm going to talk about minimalist practices of divestment, so getting rid of things, and acquisition, so how things are kind of brought in, so to speak. And then finally, I'm going to conclude looking at my main question throughout all of this is if minimalism can be considered as sustainable or a sustainable kind of non-consumer lifestyle. So to start off with then, if anyone's not heard of minimalism before, what on earth is it? It can be a little bit tricky to define, or it can be very difficult to find pictures to encapsulate what minimalism is. But it really is, it's quite simply a lifestyle choice based on the simple premise of less is more. And what it is a lifestyle choice that involves people voluntarily reducing or not having a lot of possessions, kind of keeping their possessions and the things and objects in their lives to a real bare minimum. And the premise behind that is this idea of making space. And that can be physical space and space of the home, temporal, having more time, or mental space, so being happier, having less stress, and the idea of making that space for the important things in life. I put that in little quotes because often that means to people things, the non-material things in life. So things like our own personal well-being, things like experiences, what we do, and our relationship with other people. So that's the kind of idea of what minimalism is in a nutshell. I was really interested in doing this research as to where the term originated, because normally when you hear the term minimalism, it originated in thinking about art and architecture, and in particular modernism, so the early to mid 20th century, things like the very famous German art school, Bauhaus, in those sort of 1920s, early 1930s. And famous architects like Corbusier, and the real pioneer of modern architecture, where everything was driven by efficiency, functionalism. And I was just really interested in how that idea of functionality and efficiency is then sort of applied to minimalism as a lifestyle choice. And I think the Oxford English Dictionary provides a very helpful definition, and they say minimalism is the practice of using the minimum means necessary to achieve a desired result. And this was originally uptaken in architecture and art at this time, and then has more recently been sort of shifted towards a consumer lifestyle. And the term less is more really originates from a very famous modernist architect, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he was the one that came up with this idea of less is more in terms of architecture. And he was referring to really simple structures, very open spaces, sleek design. And now the idea of less is more from this architectural side of things has been applied more to a lifestyle choice. So that's the sort of the wording, if you like, and where the word minimalist originally related from. But there are earlier consumer movements, and I believe that minimalism really stemmed from an earlier lifestyle movement called the voluntary simplicity movement, which was a movement, or a social lifestyle movement, that emerged primarily in the US in the 1970s, and it was kicked off by Dwan Elgin, who originally coined the term when they were writing about voluntary simplicity and first started writing books about it. And interestingly, it's defined as being about people who are resisting high consumption lifestyles and who are seeking in various ways a lower consumption but higher quality of life alternative. So this idea of the good life, going back to a simple living, sort of living off the land, things like this. And it really is based on a central premise of having less in terms of material things, but having more in terms of non-material things, like more time with the people around us. So this is where I believe that the term minimalism, these are the sort of early origins of the term. Excuse me. So when did the term minimalism actually emerge in terms of it being a kind of lifestyle choice? Well, minimalism clearly closely mirrors the voluntary simplicity movement in terms of those main factors of not focusing on the material things and focusing on more immaterial things. And it has been defined as almost a second wave of voluntary simplicity by various authors writing on minimalism. But the actual term really, I noticed, emerged or almost became repopularized in around 2008, unsurprisingly around the big financial crash. So it was very much this reaction to this hugely tightened financial climate. And also alongside that, these kind of gradually increasing concerns about westernized consumer culture and huge concerns of overconsumption. So we began to see books and things emerge, like Oliver James's Affluenza, that was out in 2007, so just before the financial crash. And then other books, they're are now quite famous, social economics book, How Much Is Enough? The Love of Money and the Case for the Good Life. And, people really starting to question this kind of normalized Western assumption of having lots and lots of objects. And part of my research, I looked at how minimalist sources have developed over time, and these are some of the key minimalist books, if you will. We've got things that started to emerge really from around 2009. Leo Babauta is quite a famous minimalist. He writes for Zen Habits, and then Stuffication, we've got by James Woolman, Living More with Less. Joshua Becker, again, quite a famous minimalist. I'll talk about the idea of famous minimalists a little bit later on, with the More of Less. And then Fumio Sasaki, writing in Japan about goodbye things on minimalist living. So we started really to see in the last decade this emergence of popular minimalist inspired books. And it didn't stop there. The internet exploded with minimalist stuff, ironically. And if you don't have to do very much research into, type minimalism into Google and boom, there is so much stuff out there. We suddenly saw this emerge, a huge amount of TED Talks on sort of minimalist sentiment. So we've got one here, less stuff, more happiness, that sort of thing. If you go on YouTube, it is full of minimalist videos about minimalism and people's experiences with it. You've got people doing podcasts, there's minimalist blogs, there's an awful lot going on. So it really took off in the last decade. I want to talk a little bit more about these two chaps here, the Minimalists, because I would argue that they are almost like cult-like celebrity figures of minimalists now. They're called Joshua Fields Milburn and Ryan Nicodemus, and they started writing and talking about minimalism around 2010. And they say now on their website they help over 20 million people live meaningful lives with less through their website, books, podcasts, and Netflix films. And I think that's what really encouraged minimalism to take off, was they created this film a few years ago, Minimalism, a documentary about the important things, and they've just come up with another film about it called Less Is Now, and that came out, I think it was the 1st of January this year. And this, I found even in my research, was a lot of how people got into minimalism, because these are popular documentary films on Netflix, so huge access across the world, and this really has taken off in huge ways. And they've got hundreds of podcast entries, several books, and lots of stuff online. So these two are sort of almost like minimalist figureheads, or even minimalist celebrities in the world of minimalism. Now, of course, I can't really introduce minimalism without talking about this woman here called Marie Kondo. If you're not familiar with her, she is a Japanese organizing consultant who wrote a book in 2014, which has now sold over 10 million copies worldwide, called The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. And although not specifically minimalist, because it's more about tidying and decluttering, I think it's all part of this sort of thing we're seeing over the last decade of, getting rid of things and decluttering and minimalist living, and it's all sort of kind of part of that rubric, really. And one thing that's really encouraged her popularity again is she got a Netflix series. So she has this phrase, does it spark joy? And that's her whole premise of, you're supposed to go through your things and look at everything you own and go, does it spark joy? And if it doesn't spark joy, that's the sign to get rid of it. And she's got this Netflix show that started on New Year's Day last year, and she goes into people's homes in America and looks at all their stuff and helps them declutter everything as well. So some of the people I spoke to had mixed feelings about KonMari, but I felt like you've got to mention her, because I think she's just part of all this sort of kind of zeitgeist, really, of decluttering and less focus on material objects. Okay, so that's a minimalism in a nutshell, what it is, how it's developed over the last decade or so. I'd now like to talk about the research that I did on minimalism. So as I mentioned, I had a small research grant from the RGS, and I focused my study within the UK because I noticed in the literature there wasn't a huge amount on minimalism, and also there wasn't anything specifically that I could find about minimalists in the UK at that point. And what I did, or what I'm doing, is a big analysis of all these sort of minimalist books, blogs, YouTube videos, TED Talks and podcasts, all the sorts of things I was just talking about. And in terms of my primary data collection, I've so far conducted 15 interviews with people that self-define as being minimalists within the UK. And I managed to, I thought it was going to be really difficult. I thought, oh, how am I going to find these people? Turns out it was very simple. There are huge social media groups with lots of minimalists. And I managed to do the classic approach of talking to gatekeepers, so people that were the big administrators of these groups. And I managed to interview a few of those in sort of the various cities, including Birmingham, Manchester and London, across the UK. And once I'd interviewed them, then I was able to kind of put a little advert out onto these social media sites saying I'm looking for more participants. And that's how I found the participants. Lots of people were really willing to talk to me. I did a couple of interviews online. This was pre-COVID, obviously, when I did the research. So it just was coming to. I had to stop doing face-to-face things. I did some in coffee shops, in people's offices, in the university campus. And I also managed to do a few home visits as well, where I could talk to people about minimalism in the space of their home. And they were very kind. They sent me photos and talked about how minimalism played a part in their lives. And I asked them all these different questions about their roots to minimalism, their motivations, their values, and their practices, what they actually did, how they got rid of things, and how things appeared in their lives. And I ended up having a little bit of a gendered bias in the research without meaning to, but I had 10 female participants and 5 male. I had 2 married couples as well, who I interviewed together. I had quite a diverse age range. The youngest person I interviewed was 21, and I also interviewed people sort of in their late 50s, early 60s who were retired. So there was quite a range of occupations as well, like I said, from students to retirees, had stay-at-home parents, office workers, business owners as well. So there was quite a sort of socially economic diverse range of backgrounds as well. And I would say they maybe ranged a little in their degree of minimalism, so to speak. So these are a couple of photos of the participants' homes who were kind enough to send me things. So very, very tidy home spaces with relatively few possessions, but others could actually fit all their possessions into just a few storage boxes. So I had one participant told me he could fit everything he owned into this CAWR storage shelf from IKEA, and another person who just lived out of a backpack essentially and had a box of things in an attic somewhere, and that was it. So we had a sort of range of people that took part. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about when I spoke to the minimalists that I interviewed was, how did they get into it? What were their paths into minimalism, and what were their motivations behind it? So the first sort of group I was quite surprised by this, because I was expecting people to have had these maybe life-changing moments of discovering minimalism. Well, quite a lot of people I talked to, they were just like, oh, well, I've always just had these tendencies of not buying much and not having very much stuff at all. And the term's just become popularised around me, and now I can put almost a name to it. So another interesting thing was about a third of the participants actually had parents who were hoarders. So I'm not a psychologist, but I mean, there's obviously maybe something going on there, some sort of connection there to having maybe growing up in a very cluttered houses and lifestyles. A key thing was obviously the discovery of these sorts of minimalist sources, the things I was talking about, YouTube channels. Lots of people told me, oh, I read this book, and then that got me into it, and then I started looking it up online, I found this, or I watched a documentary on Netflix, and then I got really into it and started discovering more. So that was a really key thing. Another thing was more to do with lifestyle, and quite a few people, especially of the maybe younger generation, they'd been to university, they had jobs in various different places, lots of home moves. A couple of people got into it because they were moving. They put everything in a storage box, and or one of those big storage facilities, realised they didn't need a lot of the stuff, and that was a big way that they got into it as well. And of course, sustainability concerns, which was one of the main things I was really interested in this project. And I tried to tease out a little bit about what people's sustainable motivations were for this. And I found that there was quite an interesting mixture. So about a third of the participants that I spoke to were extremely motivated by environmental kind of benefits of minimalism. I'll talk more about this later in the talk in terms of practices, but these were the a group of people that would only buy new products that were really sustainably or ethically sourced, and they'd really like to buy secondhand things. They were worried about zero waste, they were worried about food miles and meat consumption. They had a huge kind of very environmentally aware agenda. And then about another third, or a bit more, of the participants saw their minimalist lifestyle of not having very much stuff as a very helpful, sustainable byproduct of their minimalist lifestyle, but it wasn't the main motivation. Their main motivation was the personal benefits that they got from it, but they were very happy that they felt that they were contributing to a more sustainable lifestyle as well. And then interestingly, I had a few people that were just not motivated by sustainability concerns at all. It wasn't on their agenda. They just weren't interested. So there was quite a diverse array then of motivations with regards to sustainability. However, everybody spoke about the personal benefits that they felt that minimalism gave them. The first one was this idea of being able to, the movement through space. So they felt that they could travel and move home more easily. They liked the idea that they could, put some stuff in a bag and just go somewhere, or that if they needed to move house, they could do that in a relatively straightforward fashion. It wouldn't take them a really long time. The other thing was that they felt it gave them more temporal space, or more time. They felt that they were spending less time shopping, and that because they had less possessions, they were actually spending less of their time cleaning, repairing and maintaining possessions, because they just didn't have that many to worry about. And interestingly, they felt like they had less dependence on paid work. So a lot of people were in paid work, but they felt that because they weren't spending as much and they were being quite careful with what they were buying, they had a lesser reliance on paid work, because they had a greater control of their finances, which of course then linked to their health and well-being, because they felt that they had a firmer control on their finances because they weren't buying very much, and they had a kind of sense of happiness and contentment from that, and also a general sense of well-being and happiness because they had less clutter around them, so they just didn't feel very stressed. So there were a lot of personal benefits, and everyone spoke about these slightly differently, and some were more important for others, but these were the main themes that I uncovered from the interviews. One of the key values that the minimalists that I spoke to had was a strong dislike of consumerism. And interestingly, this wasn't something I directly asked about it. I didn't say to them, do you all hate consumer culture? And they all said, yes, we all hate it. No, I didn't really ask specifically about this. It was just something that people ended up speaking about. And here are some quite helpful quotes about people's general dislike of consumerism. So this is Amanda, who I spoke to, and she's 36 and a stay-at-home parent, and she got into minimalism because she'd been on maternity leave, and having that time away from work, I think maybe she had a little bit of shift in her thinking about what she was doing with her time. And she said to me, it is constant, like thinking, oh, I want that thing, I want that thing, I want that thing. It's pretty exhausting, like constantly wanting things and thinking you need new clothes, you need this, you need this holiday, you need that holiday, you need this bike, you need that car, you need this bigger house. No, you don't, but it's just what we're kind of all made to think. And I had similar kind of approaches, or people telling me similar things like this. This is Beth, who's 29. She got into minimalism through watching some more environmental documentaries on Netflix, and then got really into minimalism. And she said to me, because we get so many different messages every day, buy, and you're expected to have a new outfit for every special occasion or activity that you take up, and there comes a bit more stuff. And similarly, this is Hannah, who's a university administrator, and she said to me, we consume and consume and consume, and you can just throw something away tomorrow and get another one the day after, or you can just keep getting it. So you can see here this general dislike of kind of continued consumption, the idea that always feeling like you need more. And similarly, a lot of the participants spoke about how shopping would always let them down, and shopping has letdowns. And they felt that shopping was often used to make one feel better, or almost to achieve a particular kind of identity or become a particular type of person. But this was never then achieved by buying something, and you just then end up wanting more and more stuff. So I think Christina, who is a lovely woman I spoke to with her husband, and she said to me, and that feeling of thrill of acquiring, this hope of by acquiring this product, I'm going to be that person. The disappointment is, you have to stuff it down and then buy something else afterwards. So I thought that really encapsulated that idea of things almost letting people down, thinking they're going to be a kind of person, feel better, and then getting it and realise, oh, they're not really, and then just wanting more. So there was a real kind of awareness of this amongst participants. Another phrase that kept popping up with this was this idea of keeping up with the Joneses. And this, again, wasn't something I specifically asked about, but I just noticed this phrase kept popping up again and again. And people told me they just really didn't like this idea of having to keep up with the Joneses. They really hated aspirational consumption, the idea of status and, buying expensive things to show off a sense of identity. And this is a nice quote from Beth again. And she says, if you live like just buy, and you have the stress every day of what to wear or keeping up with the Joneses, that causes a lot of stress. And interestingly, quite a lot of the participants saw minimalism as a way of not having to keep up with the Joneses anymore, or at all. For example, Amanda again says, a lot of it is like letting go of what other people think of you, or like I said before, keeping up with the Joneses, keeping up with everyone else. You've kind of got to try and let that go. So they saw minimalism as almost a tool, as a way of not having to kind of keep up with other people or buy certain things to almost keep up, which I thought was really interesting, because I thought that then minimalism could almost be conceptualized as a form of subcultural capital, where people are able to not have a lot of things but label it as minimalism. So it doesn't look like just having lots of things is because you potentially couldn't afford them, but because, you know, you've defined yourself as a minimalist. So it's like giving yourself this label that allows you to sort of break away from consumer culture and keeping up with the Joneses. Okay, so I'd like to talk now a little bit about minimalist practices. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a little drink. You can probably tell I've got a bit of a cold, so I'll just have a little moment. So minimalist practices. Divestment, by that I mean getting rid of things. I thought this was going to be a huge part of the project. And it turned out that actually acquisition turned into a bigger part, but I will explain why in a little bit. But I will talk about decluttering. But one of the reasons why it didn't come up as much as I thought it might was because quite a few people I spoke to had always been minimalist or had minimalist tendencies. Ever since they were little, they'd never liked having much stuff. So they never needed to declutter anything, because they never had anything to declutter. So that was sort of one group of people. And another sort of subsection would maybe declutter occasionally, and, you know, they felt like they would just get rid of things here and there if they needed to. And others that I think maybe are more sort of stereotypical of that kind of KAWR idea of getting rid of everything. That what did apply to a few people. For example, one person I spoke to, Gareth, he had a very high earning salary. He lived in a 5-bed detached house, and he got into minimalism. He was one of the first people to write a blog about minimalism in the UK. And that, when I interviewed him, he was traveling somewhere in Asia, and he lives with one backpack and travels around the world now. So he was quite an extreme example. But maybe someone a little bit more relatable is Kate. It was absolutely lovely. She was about 49, and she read the KAWR book about decluttering, and she went for it. And these are some pictures of her home, which she kindly shared with me. And you can see she went for it. There was not a lot of stuff here, and she only has 2 books, and she was telling me how she was thinking about getting rid of one of them. Because she didn't really need it. Everything she has is on her Kindle, and she seemed very happy with her very highly decluttered home. So that was in terms of decluttering amount. But one of the things I was really interesting was, where's all this stuff going to? Because I think a big critique when I was thinking about minimalism is, especially with that KAWR stuff, well, where's all this stuff going to? If we all just get rid of everything, is it all just going to the tip? You know, is this a good thing at all? But interestingly, no one spoke about things being thrown away or going into the bin. The person I spoke to, about in the last slide, Kate, she was the only person that actually mentioned a bin, but she was talking about bras and some broken bras, and she couldn't recycle them, so they had to go in the bin. But that was the only time the idea of things going in a rubbish bin came up. There was actually a really big dislike of the idea of waste and landfill. This is a quote, I'm afraid quite a long one, but it's a good one, from Jenny. And Jenny was one of the married participants, and she and her husband sold up everything when they lived in London and went to live in the Middle East, and started doing in the business, and they owned very little stuff. They got rid of everything. And she said to me, I think society needs to get real. I think more people need this kind of realization and recognition that what you don't use and can't just be thrown away, it must be passed on to someone who can make use of it. That's why I don't think a lot of people are doing what a lot of people are doing. They're just throwing it away. Anything, the stuff you find on bins and on landfill is just such a sad situation. As well as from an environmental point of view, we are very conscious. We don't throw anything away, nothing. We recycle everything. If we own something, it goes to someone that can make use of it. So you can see here this real sort of strong dislike of things going into landfill. And that was the idea of landfill and waste did pop up quite a lot in other interviews as well. And this strong desire for, if something was gotten rid of, that it could find a use. This idea that this could have a further use. A lot of that came in terms of giving things away. people did talk about selling items, but these tended to be the higher value items, and it was mainly considered that selling things was a real hassle, and it was preferred that things were given to charity shops because of, firstly, the personal convenience, but a lot of the participants really loved this idea of an object's value being passed on. There was a very conscious concern over where objects were going, where they were being decluttered to. So this is Hannah, and she was a 31-year-old administrator, and she was absolutely lovely, and she got into minimalism mainly because of financial reasons and very personal issues with some finances, but even then she would sell things because she wanted to get the money for them, but she still found it a huge hassle, and she liked the idea of passing the value on. So she says here, so things will still go to charity shops, things will still go to women's shelters. I've got a pram that I've got to take to the women's shelter at some point because the hassle of selling, it isn't worth it. And I would rather give it to somebody that needs it, or in a space where it can make money for people that need it, than either keep it or throw it away. So we see again this really conscious concern over where objects were going to after decluttering. It wasn't just, oh, let's just chuck everything in the skip. It was very much thinking about products' lifestyles and this love of them finding new value elsewhere. One thing I also wanted to touch upon is that people sometimes think about minimalism as, you know, living in an empty box room and that things don't matter. You know, let's get rid of everything, so therefore things have no importance. Whereas actually I found that because people had gotten rid of so much stuff, the things that they still owned were highly treasured to them and had a huge amount of value to them, and that they might just keep a few things that were highly sentimental. I really like this quote from Matt, who was married to Jenny, who was talking about the environmental aspects of waste. And Matt fought in Afghanistan, and he said to me, to be honest, I got one box. This is when I was talking about how much stuff he owned. Literally one box in Jenny's parents' attic, which is filled with army memorabilia, stuff from my tours in Afghanistan, medals, lots of photos, every letter that I received in Afghanistan. So those things to me personally, I would say are probably the only possessions I own that to me have a sentimental value. I've got nothing else. But you can see here that that's sort of clearly that huge importance of the things that he did have that remained. Okay, so when I was starting out doing this project, interestingly, this has become the main focus in terms of what people acquire. And I didn't think it would be, because I kind of assumed, oh, well, minimalism is just all about decluttering. And I didn't almost think about how people still did need to or still did acquire things, just that they might do it in a highly reduced manner. And this became, I was really, really interested in this because I found that people would highly limit their consumption, but when they did consume, when they did get new things or things came into their lives, they wouldn't necessarily be new, they often did this with a very highly considered and sustainable frame of mind. So firstly, I would like to talk about the limited consumption of minimalists, so reduced consumption. One thing that the minimalists that I interviewed tried to do was shop as little as possible. Shopping for recreation, window shopping, browsing, not on their radar whatsoever. A lot of people spoke about how they hated shopping with a passion. So that was one way in which shopping, in which consumption was reduced. There was also a lot of people spoke about their dislike of things like built-in obsolescence. So I had conversations about people really disliking how phones and technology are just not built to last, and how we always have to get new things because they end up breaking. So there was a real strong dislike of that. And one of the ways in which people managed to limit their consumption or reduce their consumption was, unsurprisingly, repairing and maintaining what they already owned, and being very careful with the objects that they had, making sure that that they kind of kept them for as long as they possibly could. There was quite an interesting nostalgia that I noticed for a kind of the wartime make, do and mend culture, and especially among the younger participants. Someone spoke about, oh, I wish it was like my grandparents' day, where people didn't buy as much stuff and people looked after the things that they did own. So there was this real nostalgia and encouragement to uptake a make, do and mend culture. And also the idea that we should use things up to the full product's life cycle. So participants really didn't like the idea of having something and just replacing it just for the sake of getting something new, something kind of better and newer. I really like this little excerpt from Christina and John, who were chatting together about their car. And Christina says, our policy with the car, isn't it? You buy something that's still got a Ford warranty on it. And then her husband says, 2 years old, 30,000 miles, and we keep it. And Christina says, till it dies. And John says, yes, till it dies, yes, rather than buy a new car and get a new one every 3 years. And I just like this idea of them sort of thinking about products having life cycles and only wanting to replace something once something has used up its entire life cycle, so until it dies. I really like that idea. Another way in which participants managed to limit their consumption was based on the real premise, really, of quality over quantity. So they like the idea of having fewer but higher quality objects, and the reason behind that was the idea that things that were high quality would have a longer life and would therefore be longer lasting than maybe a cheaper alternative. And it was actually seen as cheaper in the long run to invest in something higher quality if you were going to buy something, because it would last longer. Now, of course, I was grappling with this idea a little bit because I was thinking about how, you know, that might be considered quite financially exclusive, because you would need a relatively large amount of capital, say, to buy something, a big quality item to begin with. So say you were buying a coat, for example, you wanted something really good quality, that could be very, very expensive. So I was wondering if that might be financially exclusive. But I did speak to one participant, Rachel, who was a university, she works as a receptionist in a university, and she lived on her own, and she kind of mitigated this. She wanted to buy a lot of quality over quantity, and she liked buying really high quality items. So she says here, if something is expensive, I do think, okay, yeah, it's expensive, it's good quality, it'll last me ages. So a lot of it is not buying something cheap because I know it's not going to last or it's going to wear out. So if I'm buying boots, I want to make sure I buy a nice pair of hard-wearing boots that are going to last me. And interestingly, she talked about how she would be prepared to buy something more expensive if it was going to last, but she had this really clever way of managing it on her budget, where she would buy pretty much everything second hand. So she'd buy an awful lot of things like eBay. So she was really chuffed because she just got some really nice M&S, I think cashmere or something like that, for going for a song on eBay. And she bought all her summer stuff in winter and vice versa. So she'd always get things when they were less expensive and on sale and things like that. So I thought that was just a nice, interesting way. She sort of challenged how I thought about maybe how things being financially exclusive, and she sort of found this interesting way around that. So another key element of this idea of considering consumption, which one, again, I wasn't quite sure I was going to focus on at the start of this project, was actually, I found that people I spoke to, minimalism was, as I said before, was very anti-consumerism, but it wasn't necessarily anti-consumption. It was very much about very conscious choices and very focused, intentional and considered consumption when it does occur. So it wouldn't occur a huge amount, but when it did, it was very highly considered. So I spoke a little bit about this before, focus shopping. So window shopping, shopping as recreation just wasn't a thing on people's agendas. Neither was impulse purchases. So there's a nice little quote here from Beth, who says, "I've always been the type that I go out and have something in my mind of what I wanted to buy. I don't just buy on the spot, I impulse buy. I really do think about what I'm buying." And lots of people, when they did go shopping, they would have lists and they plan exactly what they were going to get if they were going to go. And taking time to consider what was being purchased was a really big thing on the agenda. So sometimes people took weeks to decide if they were going to buy something. So something people did was they might take pictures, on the internet and make a wish list of the things that they might want, but then they'd leave it, come back to it a few weeks later, and often go, "Oh, actually, I don't really want that. I don't need that." And it was a way of helping them prevent impulse purchases. Another key thing was prioritizing needs versus wants. So this is Rachel, who talked about how she only tries to buy something if she really needs it. So a lot of what I buy, if I see something, I always think, I like it, but do I really need it? Or do I really want it? So there was that kind of thinking about needs versus wants. And also this interesting consideration of how much time an item would take up. So she says again, I'm going to buy something. If I'm going to buy something, I really think about the time and effort, the upkeep, and all of that goes with something. And if it's going to take up my time, I just think I'd rather not have it. So I'm really quite ruthless. And Rachel told me how she actually broke up with a previous boyfriend because he spent all day the weekend washing his car and had this big fancy car. And she was just like, no, I just don't really fancy being with someone like that whose an item is that important to them. So that was an interesting consideration as well. Now, oh, my slides have gone funny. There we go. So another thing that was quite important and came out was this idea of sustainable and ethical consumption. And I mentioned before that this wasn't for everyone. So lots of people bought things secondhand. Lots used charity shops, online platforms, things like eBay, Gumtree, and a lot of that was to do with reduced costs. But for some, there was a real sustainable element behind it. And that was a really key thing, and they saw that buying something secondhand was a great way, if they needed something, was not having to sort of bring a new object into the world, but to use something that was already owned. So one of the people I spoke to, Leanne, was hugely into the environmental side of this, and she said how she was coming from a zero waste perspective, and that she really just didn't want to buy anything new, and why would she if she didn't have to? And this came up a lot about when people were talking about fashion, and a lot of the participants were really keen to only buy clothing from ethical, environmentally sustained brands. And there was very much a dislike of fast fashion and trends, and big concerns about garment producers. So I spoke to one of my participants who told me a wonderful story about how he had spent 2 months researching what pair of jeans he needed to buy. 2 months. Because he was so concerned about the ethical and environmental practices of whatever company he was going to buy from. And he finally decided on a pair of jeans, and he went up to the counter to buy them, and then he suddenly couldn't because he realised they had a tiny patch of leather on the back, and he was a vegan, and so of course he couldn't buy them. And being vegan was actually, sorry, I've gone ahead, it was something that came up that I wasn't expecting. And I suddenly noticed, oh, quite a lot of people told me that they're vegan, or that they're cutting down on their meat, or they're pescatarian. And so there was this interesting correlation there of these kind of people with real strong awareness of the environmental impacts of their lives, not just through buying things, but also buying food as well. And there was a strong preference amongst this group for local seasonal food, a concern about food miles, and also a big concern about food packaging as well. So that was just this interesting kind of thing that came out from the research that I wasn't necessarily going in to look for, but that came out. So in order to sort of conclude, my main sort of question throughout all of this was, could minimalism be considered a sustainable consumer lifestyle? And I really just, by looking at these interviews, noticed this kind of almost strange difference between sometimes motivations and practices. So the practices that I've talked about in terms of divestment were very considered. And as I mentioned, there was this real emphasis on not throwing things away, liking to donate things or sell them, but really, you know, not just throwing things in the bin. And then in terms of acquisition, we saw this very highly reduced, highly considered and very intentional consumption, and also for some a real strong emphasis on ethical and sustainable consumption as well. And then the motivations, it was just interesting because the sustainability motivation just wasn't really for everyone. If you remember before, there were those three categories of some who were highly motivated, some who saw it as a byproduct, and a few who just weren't bothered at all. But interestingly, how the personal benefits of minimalism were a key driver for everyone. So the way I sort of thought about this is minimalism might be considered sustainable in practice or outcome, if not always in motivation or intent. And I've always thought that was pretty interesting because other people have looked at anti-consumerism lifestyles and argued that they must be personally appealing for them to become popular, because if they're not, don't have lots of personal benefits, then it's harder for people to uptake them. So I think these strong personal benefits of minimalism really explains why it's increased in popularity. But I also think it really shows its potential importance as the practices of minimalism, of not buying very much stuff, and when you do acquire things, doing so in a very highly considered, conscientious manner, might make that sustainability in terms of the actual practices of it, even if the motivations are for ones of personal well-being as well. I'm going to leave it there because I realise I'm quickly running out of time. Thank you very much for listening.